Good morning and welcome to this virtual tech update on conversational UI. It's now 9 o'clock and now everybody should be able to hear the sound and hopefully see the video. Please turn your video on but stay muted during the presentation. I am Julie Borg-Nellegard and I will be moderating this event. Initially, I would like to start out with a question for you to answer in the chat. And it's a question you see here on the screen. It reads, have you already identified a customer interaction, either sales or service-oriented, where chatbots could make a difference? And while you provide your answer in the chat, I will do a short introduction. So Trifork has been running these tech updates for a few years now. And in fact, 2 years ago to the day, after some of the largest developer conference in the world, from Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, we made a similar event on conversational UI with a focus on voice assistants. Our focus this morning will be on another type of conversational UI, chatbots. So much has happened in the last couple of years as technological progress and advancements are made every day, but we're still seeing some of the largest cloud providers investing millions into technology like this, which is changing the way we interact with software and thus the way we interact with our customers. At one hand, you can strongly increase the user experience that you're providing your customers, and on the other hand, you can increase the efficiency of how you develop these solutions and backend-driven applications. So why should you get started on this journey? Let's listen to our experts today and dig deeper into the complexity that conversational UI can address with its oftentimes simple and transparent design to create highly personalized experiences and solve problems for your customers and users in real time with great UX in a backend-driven application. Today, we have not only one, but two great speakers. First, I'm very thrilled to introduce Line Munkholm Haukrogh as one of today's experts. Welcome, Line.
Thank you.
Line is overall responsible for digital retail channel development at Danske Bank, heading up digital banking retail channels. She is responsible for digital channel strategies and execution of current channel portfolio, building omni-channel capabilities, as well as the UX and design approach at Danske Bank. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today, Line. Our second expert is Ayub Hajim. Welcome, Ayub.
Hi, Julie.
Ayub is a team lead at Trifork with a background in software engineering. He has over 8 years experience working with a variety of technologies from Android development and web frontend using Angular to backend using Kotlin and Java. I know that you'll come here to listen to these great experts and we will kick things off in a minute. But before, I would like to share just a few practical notes. So as mentioned, please turn your camera on, but stay muted during the entire presentation. The presentation will be recorded and you'll of course be able to receive the recording and the slides afterwards once you've filled in a quick survey. Then we invite you to engage with us during the webinar using the chat to write either comments or questions. At the end of the presentation, we'll go through as many of your questions as we possibly can. As mentioned, we really appreciate your feedback. So please spare us a few minutes just to fill out this post survey. It will be to you. So a warm welcome to everyone. I hope you'll enjoy the next 45 minutes. Please ask a lot of questions. And without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Line.
Thank you, Julie. So I've really been looking forward to today. And I know you briefly mentioned that conversational UI or chatbots can either be text or voice. And today we'll focus on text. So I will be talking both about very simple bots. So that's basically where you can't type in text, but you choose a predefined answer. And about also talking a little bit about what is a chatbot that is slightly more intelligent and where you as a user has a larger flexibility in the interaction. But a chatbot is not necessarily a new thing. In fact, when you Google, you can find all sorts of examples. And I think what's tricky and what we're going to talk about today is that it's actually not difficult to develop or to launch a bot. I think the difficult part is to figure out what will then create the great experience. So what I'll do today is, of course, talk a little bit about the learnings and reflections we have in Danske Bank. But before going into that, just highlighting some of the great other solutions out there to hopefully also inspire you guys. They have at least inspired us. So some of the success stories, actually before going into that, conversational UI is not a new thing. Those of us who are a little bit nerdy will know that even the first command lines were the first kind of conversational UI. That is of course not what we plan to show to customers, but just the idea of being able to interact was already kind of present there. Some of the examples I do want to highlight is actually from travel. So KML, that's a great example. If you look at their app and how they've understood that there's actually a pre-booking interaction, there's the whole travel in itself, and then you actually also get to your destination at some point. So for KML to understand when is a conversation needed, so when do we build a conversational UI where we can have the right dialogue, but also present the relevant informations or opportunities, possibilities along the way. So if you don't know the KML app, I would definitely recommend that. Another example, and actually an example of how and conversational UI has fundamentally changed the way we can shop, is Operator. It sounds like a very technical name, but if you don't know it, then it's a platform where you can basically both voice or type in what you're looking for, and then the chatbot on the intelligence behind this will guide you through the shopping experience, and in a way both meet your needs but also cater for the relationship and also the simplicity, because when you start looking for things online, it should be made simple, right? I also think it's fair mentioning examples as Lidl or Domino's, who knows that what you are there to do is actually not waste your time, and as simple as possible get the best offer of what you need right now. So they have a good combination of conversational UI and then also presenting their product offerings in a simple way. So, but it's not all success stories out there. We've definitely also seen examples of when this could go wrong. And I've just included a few here on the next slide. Back in 2017, when the first, I think, really tests with voice, but also more advanced chatbots, we saw that quite a few Chinese chatbots were learning, and they were also quickly shut down because some of the replies were not in line with what the authors had anticipated. I'm not going to go into details. I think I also want to show a few examples where, for example, the Wall Street Journal had a very simple subscribe, unsubscribe bot. The challenge here was that every time you unsubscribed, it went into a loop and subscribed you again and presented you with options. So that's something you want to avoid by developing a chatbot. There's also often when you develop a chatbot, it's to have a simpler interaction or to get feedback right away. Then we have a good example from a French solution where it's here in the bottom to say, how would you describe bot to your grandma, where because it's a text pre-filled, the user can actually reply and say, well, my grandmother is dead. And then because the answer from the bot was pre-filled, it's like, all right, thank you for your feedback. So again, a good example of if your user can type in free text, you need to be very mindful of how you answer. A famous example is also the Poncho weather bot, who was the creators thought it should be fun, it should be social, very much in line with their brand, and that's important. But the bot actually kind of took a life on its own and almost stopped giving weather advice and instead just asked people about their personal life. Anyway, so there's some do's and some don'ts. Let's try to look at the, just to ups and downs, summarize some of the learnings, because what we saw in Danske when we started looking into this 5-6 years ago was that, as I mentioned, building a bot was easy, but how did we make it useful? One of the things we first realized was it needs to be simple first. So start small and scale, like in any other practice. So narrow the domain, understand, hey, let's start with just maybe guiding to the nearest ATM or transferring money to staying in financial services, right? Also make sure that when you interact with customers, just like in real life, they actually expect you to remember what they told you. So if you start interacting with your users or customers, please structure how you collect and save your data, of course, with respect to what we're allowed to do and what consents you have. But remember that a digital dialogue is still a conversation. And then when you have a conversation, you expect to be remembered. Avoid false options. So avoid having a flow that is complex or where you leave customer in a dead end. It sounds like a no-brainer, but actually pretty tricky when you design flows to avoid this, so keep that in mind. Everything in a digital dialogue conversational UI should be convenient and easy, otherwise you need to consider if it's not a dialogue, but something else that you need to use for interaction. There's a bunch of other learnings, but just let's get a little bit more concrete, and then I'll try to repeat some of them. Back in 2014-15, we decided in Danske Bank that we wanted to develop a new mobile bank. In fact, we didn't really want to develop a mobile bank only. We wanted to change our digital interfaces from transactional to relational. So we understood that it needed a new digital bank, and that needed to be building the relationship. And all of us know that relationships are also built through dialogue. So what we did was saying, okay, we need to understand when is conversational UI useful and actually supports building this relationship, and when do we need to do other things. I'll try to make an overview here, just highlighting some of the learnings and group some of the learnings that we have had at Danske. What we quickly learned was simple interaction where you use a bot with predefined answers works really well, and you should use conversational UI for that. Help and feedback, that's a little bit more tricky, because you saw the example with the grandma and explanation. You want to make sure that if you put in a free text field, that you actually can provide the right answer. So we have done some good things, and we've also done some things that we had to change afterwards. Service and product offerings, I think here Lidl and Domino, the examples I showed you before, are good examples of how you need to mix the conversational UI with an actual product catalog on a different way of showing what you have on your shelves or the advice you want to give. Then I put in overviews and complex interactions as one of the more tricky areas. And that's not the same as you can never use conversational UI or chatbot in that case, but it's more to say that the underlying requirements for knowledge base and making sure that you're consistent across channels actually put a lot of demand on you as a business. So before kind of jumping into deep water, you probably want to get experience on the first few items or examples first. Just being concrete and actually also learning a bit from KML and the travel business, that what we saw was then when customers want to book a meeting with us or get in contact with us, actually using, as you can see in the first screen, a relatively simple bot where the answers that you can provide are pre-filled, that works really well. Because it's still, when you want to book a meeting with the bank, it's nice to get guided. So using simple bots in a situation where you're going to get guided, where it's easy, makes sense. Then the second, it becomes a little bit more complex into the flow, and you need to decide both on a date and a form. Do you want e-meeting or personal meeting or a face-to-face meeting? The conversational UI doesn't really meet the requirements. We tested it, and all of a sudden it becomes a very complex conversation instead of this. So know when you need to present an overview like this, and typically it is when it comes to a combination of the why do I want it, the when, and the what. You need to move away from conversational. In our developing of the new mobile bank and also some of the other channels that we have in Danske, we also learned that please remember that conversational UI is for a conversation and not a monologue. If you look at the first screen here, it's an example of how we actually push hopefully relevant information to our mobile users. But if you choose the format of a bot and it's only a push message from us and there's no call to action, it's not received that well. So that's something we're going to change. Also understanding that currency conversion and feedback. Again, it's a currency conversion, that's just a service, so it's not a conversation, let's not turn it into that. Feedback, that's just a form, it's us asking for something. Again, it's not necessarily a conversation. Then I wanted to give a little bit more complex example, because now I talked about the simple bots or the chat bots and how you want to mix different forms of interaction designs. What we learned is that often what starts out as a conversation or a message in a mobile often leads the customer to want to interact with us in other channels. So just to provide you with an example here, what we see is that when we push a message or give a contextual advice in the mobile, we of course on our end dependent on big data, but for the customer it's a simple message in the mobile. Then they can read the message and get insights. If they want to act on this, we need to make sure that it's a one-to-one, or it's, as we try to say, one-to-me communication, so it's perceived as personal and something you want to continue the dialogue on. It also needs to contain a clear call to action, and this is also where we have at least learned that just because we may be on a roll in designing conversational UI, that's not necessarily how the user prefers to continue the dialogue. So you need to make sure that your call to action meets user needs. Here you can call us, then have a conversation, again, shifting between channels being recognized. Then after the call, it's important for us to summarize and say, hey, this is what we talked about. It could also be pushing an agreement for signing and so forth. Finally, it's important when you have dialogues, whether it's via conversational UIs or in another way with a customer, make sure that it can be found again. So have an archive. That's on the same for internal use as well, because the more conversational UIs or chatbots we have in combination with face-to-face or online meetings, the more dialogues are actually taking place, and it needs to be combined in one place to maintain the relationship to the customer. Very important. Then I also think what I've said up until now has kind of also been part of our ambition since 2014-15 when we started out. What we can also see now is that from having a focus on when to use conversational UI, when to apply simple bots or chatbots, what we can also see now is that in order to succeed, we need to move away from only focusing on the conversation, but also the context and applying more data and making sure that it's actually based on your behavior, not only in our channels. So what you see here is also examples of how we want to apply that. That was me speed talking. Yeah. But I know there's room for questions also. So this is actually where I wanted to start. And then back to you, Julie.
Thank you very much, Line. Yeah, that's actually a great bridge to a Joop's presentation. And just to mention, please type in your questions in the chat. We will take as many of them as possible in the end. But during the presentation, please type them in the chat. I will make sure to collect them and answer them or ask them to the speakers. They will answer them. And then I'll hand it over to you, Joop.
Thank you very much, Julie. And thank you, Lina. That was really good. Let's dig into how we can do it technically now. And I think you should stop sharing your screen so I can share. I was not able, yes, now I can. All right. Oh. Sorry for that. It was here. I don't know why it jumped. All right. So conversational, I think Lina already talked about the definition of conversational or what is conversational, but I will focus mainly on two parts of the definition of conversation, which has that the human part and the conversation part. So before or through history, our interaction with the machine was imposed by the machine itself. So just the fact that we have to click button That's not us. That's not human. That's not how we interact with each other, for example. So we were interacting in machine terms, but conversational is switching that interaction from machine terms into human terms. So now we are the ones who dictate to the machine how we should interact with it, which is human language. So we need to use our language instead of the machine language. And the second part is that this all happens through a conversation. So a conversation should be unpredictable, dynamic, and interactive, because when I am speaking with someone, I am not expecting the answer. So that's unpredictability, and the answer of that person can change. Even if I ask the same question, the answer of that person can change. So before, I mean, why conversation now? What happened? Because as also Lina mentioned, conversational have been there, like even command line is a kind of conversation, right? But what happened now? So it's so hyped. So first, the power of chat. So chat have been there like long time ago, from the 90s with SMS, and that's a sort of chat. But recently, everything is through chat. So we became more and more familiar to chat, and it became more intuitive to us to speak to each other, like not only directly or over the phone, but through chat. We started using emojis. We started being like pro in chatting. There is even tools now where you can hold your phone with 2 fingers so you can chat easily. So that increased a lot. And then customer expectation with that. So our customers became so needy. They are not able now to just like perform an action and then wait for 10 seconds until that action is fulfilled. They require instant answer. They require something that interacts with them. Tooling maturity as well. There is a lot of tooling right now, like in the IT ecosystem, in technology in general. There is like cloud native, serverless, so you are able, and accessibility also. 5G is coming, so all of those tooling and technologies are mature right now, and they are like ready to use. So that helped into making conversational more interactive. Also the natural language processing tooling as well. So natural language now more than ever is a really good. So all the IT giant in the world, Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, they all are contributing they all have their own product first for natural language understanding. And also they are like putting millions into that. So they are like pushing this technology so much. Yes, and how, in my opinion, at least a tool, we can say that a tool is mature enough. It's if we have first the ability to deploy in multiple environment, development, test, and production, so we can test differently. The ability to automate the test, and the ability to get feedback while in production. And all of those right now exist in those natural language understanding engines. Guideline and best practices. I'm not going to say anything about that because Lina said it all already. So there is already a list of best practices. People have experience, like Danske Bank, on doing that, and they are, and Google and many people are listing a list best practices, so we can use them and we can benefit from their experience. All right. So before I actually talk about how to get there technically, I want to have a step back and then go back to a normal communication between a phone and a backend. So this is just, forget about conversational for a moment. If you have a mobile app, right? So this is your mobile app on the left, and then you need to connect to your backend, and you need to interact with your data. So you have some computation that solves your business, and you have a mobile app, and you need to fetch that data from your backend and then render it in the screen. There is multiple ways on how to achieve this kind of communication, but I will mainly look at 3 kinds of communication. So there is the imperative approach, and there is the data-driven UI approach, and then there is the backend-driven UI approach. Those are only 3 of many, but we will also focus only on the imperative approach and the backend-driven UI approach. Let's start with the imperative approach, which is the most intuitive to a developer and the most common way to create mobile apps. So first, the UI is built on the mobile. So everything is pretty much fixed within the parts of the phone. So you actually define, okay, for this example, just as an example, we will take a car loan application. So let's say you want to take a loan to buy a car. And then you look at the app, you need to specify what kind of car you need. So this is the page that we are looking at. And it's fixed. So the list of cars, they are fixed by categories on the phone. So you prepare that, and then you fetch the data. As you can see here, this is the information that you get from your backend, and then the phone have the responsibility to take that data and then put it in those prepared sections on the phone and then show it. So the mobile clients fills the UI. This have a lot of limitations. The most important one is that, let's say now you have a new category of cars or a new something that happens, then you will need to ask if you are doing different platforms, Android and iOS, you are not cross-platform, then you need to ask your developer for Android and for iOS separately to actually create the new section and then go through the release process, and then you are ready to show the new data. And even if it's as simple as changing the sorting, then you may probably need to request a new release, which is really, really cumbersome. So now let's talk about backend-driven UI, which works a little bit differently. So the way backend-driven UI works is that the phone, we reduce the responsibility from the mobile client. So the phone doesn't describe the sections or the business, anything related to your business specifically. It describes in general, how can I show UI completely dumb component that have no logic? So how can I render a list, or how can I show a list, and how can I interact with it? How can I show a button, and how can I interact with it? Same for labels, and that's everything the phone does. And then the phone expects from the backend to actually send elements. If you can see here in the payload received from the backend, it contains the element of type list. So in this case, the phone knows, oh, I need to render a list, and then that list contains items, and every item has some data, right? So then the backend is the one dictating what exactly to show, and the mobile app is only taking care of how to show it. And then in this example, for example, let's say now, instead of this list, we just want to render a grid or show a grid. Then the only thing that we need to do is that from the backend, instead of saying that the element that I want to render is a list, we just say that the element that we want to render is a grid. And just like that, like on the fly, on runtime, the application will render a grid instead. By the way, this way of development, or this architecture, is already adopted by Spotify. So there is even an open source project called Spotify Hub framework that actually does that. So you have a backend side, and then an SDK for Android and iOS, and then you describe a UI, and then it is automatically rendered. So it's completely business independent or industry independent. All right. So now we know what is backend driven UI. Let's go back to conversational. So I want to here show you an example of how is a chat dynamic, and why I had to explain all of this, backend driven UI concept and stuff like that. Because since we talked earlier that already a conversational UI should necessarily be dynamic and predictable as a conversation, then the only way to actually implement this is that you implement your backend driven UI, because you don't want that every time you want to change the way you show things to the customer in a chat, you don't want to make a new release of your app. That's for one. And also for two, you want to actually iterate over your flow and implement multiple flows that lives within the same UI. Because for an app, you can create multiple pages or multiple views. But for a chat, it's exactly the same chat, the same feel, the same experience. So you want to keep that UI. The only thing that changes are the component that you feed to that UI. So this is why backend driven UI is quite important for conversational. All right, let's start this one now. Oh, what happened? I want you only to focus on don't focus on the chat, just focus on the component. So first we have a list, then we have a carousel, then we have a slider, number pad in here. So my point here is that all of those, and yeah, and a date picker, so you can solve your needs and then change the component on the fly. Here is even a address lookup text. So you can search for address, and then we call Dava. So we perform a request to Dava for addresses. All right. One thing that is really also cool to mention here. So this application is only for demo. So it's only for this event. Before that, we have used backend-driven UI in here in Trifork, and we have an example for a completely different industry that I'm not in a liberty to show or to talk about. So then I asked one of the developers, like, how would it take to actually create a chat for us? And then he just did it in 2 hours or like 3 hours. So few hours, he just completely changed the industry. And that's the power of the backend driven UI, is that you don't care if it was, for example, for, I don't know, e-commerce or anything. You can very quickly change it as soon as you have the component done correctly. How is the architecture? So we have a mobile application, as you see in the screen. We have a UI backend in the middle, and then we have a data backend. So the UI backend and the data backend can belong to the same server. So if you already have a backend that feed your mobile application, you can of course add the UI part to it. But I will really advise not to do that. I would advise to create a separate service for the UI. Why is that? Is because maybe later you want to integrate with a different source of information. Then you don't need to re-implement anything. You just need to integrate your UI backend with that other data provider. And then you can also go into a legacy and then remove your other data backend, and then you can do a lot of stuff. It offers you a lot of flexibility. All right, so far we talked about unpredictability and how dynamic could a chat be, and the conversation part using backend driven UI. Now we are going to talk about the left side, which is human terms interaction. And as also Lena mentioned earlier, that a chat can build a relation or can build interaction with the user. It needs also to be smart, and that's also what characterizes a human. So that's where natural language understanding comes in. So natural language understanding, not only to make it human-like and to make it more intuitive, so people can actually, instead of you imposing the answers to the user and then asking them like choose one of those 3 answers, as I showed you from the lists and the carousel, you can actually ask the user, how can I help you today? And let the user express himself in free text. Of course, in some cases, that's not a good idea, but in many other cases, that's really a good idea. Why is that? It's because if you let the customer express himself as he or she wishes, then you can have more insights on what to focus. What is the customer need? It's like a very good way on know your customer, and not in a legal or financial way, know your customer, but really know your customer. Like you can get from the customer what he expects from that chatbot to provide. And then you can iterate, as Lena also said, that start small and then iterate and then improve. You can also, based on what is the customer free text, you can also iterate and then improve your chatbot to give the best user experience. You will not get that much insight if you are always fixing the answer for your customer, even though it has been proven that fixing the answer is in many cases a good idea. So the customer, you don't let the customer go a lot far from what you expect the customer to ask you. All right, I will move on. So we have here where the NLP or the natural language processing engine fits. We have the application, we have the UI backend, and then we have the natural language processing engine, and then we have the data. Tools in the market. All right. So instead of you implementing your backend-driven UI, you can choose to use Communicate, which have an integration, automatic integration with Android and iOS. So it have an SDK for both platforms. It have an integration, automatic integration with Dialogflow or any other bot framework. So also in the NLP, you can of course do it on your own, but it's really a bad idea because Google, Facebook, and Microsoft will have more knowledge on human language than you do. So please use those tooling as you see fit. Takeaways. You may get it right. You may get it wrong at first. So start now because it's not easy to get it fast. So you will need to iterate over it and iterate so you are able to improve every time. Backend driven UI is the only way to go. And trust me on this. You may think that it is just development, but just to be honest, just the fact of thinking backend driven is kind of different of what is most intuitive to developers. So developers are so used to the imperative approach. So they go to a mobile phone and they are like, do this, show this. When clicked on this button, do this. Instead, you cannot think that way. You need to think more into a declarative way rather than an imperative way. You need to say, if I receive this UI from the backend, then I show this and then I do this. And then you prepare all of this. So you are prepared for all cases and you have no idea what are you going to receive. And as soon as you receive something, then you interact accordingly. Be smart, make it smart. If you are not planning to do natural language understanding, to be honest, your chatbot is extremely limited. You don't get insights on what is the customer need. You don't get even, you know, in the natural language understanding tools, you are also able, if you didn't understand something, you are able to fall back. You are able to give a way out to the customer. You are able, if you are not able to do an action, you are able to give the customer at least a direction. Maybe you are not very able to do that in predefining the choices. You can, maybe you cannot, maybe you can, but you are limited on how to do it, because if you ask the customer very predefined question, then there is no improvement. Then you don't get the scenario that you didn't think of. Focus on your business and build a custom solution. Of course, there is all of those, you know, chatbot framework that enterprise call themselves enterprise chatbot framework for insurance or for banking or for any industry, and they are like predefined for all of this industry. I don't advise you doing this, because a chatbot needs to be very specific, fulfilling your customer need specifically. So if you go generic, you can end up in a very generic solution that fails at giving a very good user experience. And then use the best practices. You know them already by now, I guess, and you can read more about it. And then there is now a big list on how to approach chatbots or how to approach conversation. All right, so I will be back to Julia, so you can take it from here into talking about this question.
Thank you very much, Ayub. And of course, we hope you got some inspiration on potential use cases. So please, again, answer in the chat if you identified some customer interaction, either sales-driven or service-oriented, where conversational UI could make a difference for you. But now it's time for some questions, and we have heard a lot from our two great and fast-speaking experts. So I understand if you need some time to digest all of it. If questions pop up later, for instance, tonight while brushing your teeth or showering, please get in touch later. For now, please use the chat to ask any and all questions you might have. I have gotten, at least I can see a couple here. So what I will do now is I will share my screen, and we will use this Jamboard to show the questions. And I can see a few more are in the chat, but let's get started with these. They came during your presentation, Line, so I think they're probably mainly for you, but Ayub, we're also very happy to hear your perspective. For the first one, it reads, there are many players in the market. Where do we look for inspiration? what's the next step? Is it more of the same? And I think it's kind of a few questions in one, but let's start with you, Line.
Yes, I fully agree. There are many players in the market. For us in Danske, where we look for inspiration, it's very much to actually, not the solution itself, but to understand how do we involve customers in taking the next step. Because we do understand what the conversational UI should look like. I think Ayub also did a great presentation in saying what's the underlying architecture and knowledge base and all of that needed to actually have a great experience. But we also know that data and your personal information becomes more and more important to the individual. So we need to understand kind of how to combine that and actually maybe to change the dialogue in the future. So we look outside of financial services also very much.
Okay, thank you, Line. Ayub, anything you want to add? Not for this one. Let's jump to the next. I can see more questions are popping in the chat. That's really good. The next question is a little aligned to what you just said, Line, but how do you involve your customers in the process?
Yes, we involve our customer in our kind of service design agile sprint as we have always done. I think what has changed here when we talk about conversational UI is actually taking a more anthropological view on this, or understanding the social mechanisms in this, because it is all of a sudden a dialogue where we need to make sure that the intelligence and the wording behind this also meet your expectations. A good example, now it's a long answer, I know you, but a good example is also when choosing the icon for your bot. What we quickly learned by involving customers is that the second you add a person, so a female icon or a male icon instead of just a bot or a robot, you're actually almost already placing an expectation or bias in that conversation. So that is something you need to keep in mind when introducing conversational UI.
Okay, thank you very much. I will quickly jump to the next, and here is a little more technical question. So let's get started with you, Ayub. Here the question reads, have you had any concerns around offline versus online in relation to backend driven UI?
That is an extremely good question. So when you think about conversational, I don't think you can think about offline, because especially if you do natural language processing, that happens in the server. You are not able to decrypt human language within the phone so far, at least. Of course, there is trials and stuff to have something running, the models running in the phone, but so far it's not there. So I think it's more online. And to be honest, like in my mind, like technology is going into, most of technologies is going more and more into like online. The concept of online is getting smaller, I think, but that's still a very good question.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, can I add to that?
Yes,
so because I answered halfway, so that I focused more into natural language processing. But now let's talk about backend driven UI. So in backend driven UI, you receive actually data, you receive the components that you need to render in your screen. You are still able to cache those in your phone. So the only difference is, instead of you saving the data only, like my data is car and car number and car ID, instead of only saving the data for the car and then reusing it, and then the phone tells how to reuse it, when I am offline, I can still save the components, a list instead of a car. I would say a list item, a button, a label. So you can do the same things that you do in a imperative approach or classical approach.
Okay, thank you, Ayub. And for any of these questions, if you would like it to be elaborated more, you have more questions related to it, please just follow up with those. We have another one here, and Line, this is related, it's a little long, but it's related to the one you were just talking about with involving the customers. So what about monitoring the solution when it's live? How do you involve a real person in the conversation completely derail? If the conversation completely derails or goes into a loop, do you take over the session, or do you evaluate the data after the damage the last didn't come with it, but after the damage has happened?
I think that's a super good question, which is also why when starting with the chatbots or conversational UI, you need to start with the small use cases and get the experience. Three things I think are important here. One being, it's always important that there's a clear opt-out or call to action also in a chatbot. So it can't be this dead-end loop where you force the customer into recurrent answering the same question. So test your chatbot, test your dialogue model when you do this. What we try to understand, and that's already in the designing phase, is that when would you typically want to opt out or change channel? So that might be you want to change channel to email. It might also be you want to call, or you want to set up a meeting. And then that call to action should be readily available and rather proactively from us than putting the user in a waiting situation and then taking the next steps themselves. So we are trying to design for actually introducing the call to actions or the next steps rather sooner than later in such a dialogue.
Yeah, so you have
and
to...
for the damage part that I couldn't quite read, I don't think we've had kind of damaging situations. I think we've had, I showed you the example of the one-way communication where you actually in a dead end. And that is something where then of course it's not as good as an experience for the user, because if you want to act on something in the text, we leave you without an option. So it comes back to understanding, is it a conversation? Is it a monologue? And who's benefiting from the conversation, because you should always design this to help the user. And then I'm sure it will be a benefit for you as a company also in the end.
Yeah, and I guess since it's enabling personalized experiences and user flows, you have to take into consideration that there can be a great variety in the user journeys in this. Definitely,
and here I think there's also an understanding, are you behind some sort of login so we know the user and past behavior and all of that? If it's before login, have there been any cookie consent or other that we can utilize to make this more personalized? So it's again, add the complexity, also dependent on how far are you on the journey, so you actually stay control of the experience you provide.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah, a quick one, Ayub.
No, I wanted to very quickly add to that, is that the tooling right now, technology again, offers a kind of tree on where you failed to resolve your customer need. So next time, as Lina said, you can iterate and improve your chatbot to actually fix those. And then the more you have your chatbot in the wild, the more you learn. And then, as to answer Klaus, Dialogflow is the best one to do that. And it's by far the best tool to use, in my opinion.
Awesome. There are more great questions, but we simply don't have time to answer them all. We will follow up and we will go through them. And if you have more, as mentioned, please get in touch afterwards. I think here in the end, Line, you mentioned in the beginning that building a bot is easy, but it's difficult to build a useful one. So I think at last here, I would like to ask you, Line and Ayub, if you were to give one final piece of advice to the people tuning in today on how to get started and how to get it right, what's the one thing you want the audience to remember? And let's start with you, Line.
Perfect. I think start by not thinking that you want to do a bot, but understand your customer pains, and then you'll realize that some of them are fairly simple and can be solved via a bot. So that's what I would start with.
Thank you. And you, Ayub?
I would say same thing, know your customer, but also know your technology. And that's as important as you know your customer.
So that are really important points and really important takeaways. This is our last tech update before the summer holidays, but we'll kick off again at the end of August, where Apple and our Smart Enterprise team will share their take on UX and UI in the enterprise. So stay tuned and keep an eye on our events page for all future tech updates. If you have specific topics, technologies you'd like to hear more about, please let us know. On behalf of myself, our fantastic speakers, and Trifork, thank you all for joining us here today. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope to see you another time. Please provide some feedback in the post survey and enjoy your summer. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.